Give me a warm welcome to Dr. Wagner.
Thank you, Todd. I just have to adjust the pages a bit for my eyes to make sure I can read the words properly, because I'm getting older and it's not like when I was young. Anyway, I want to explain why Alberta needs to become independent. Now, to understand the reason for Alberta to become, why we need to become independent, it's best to look at Alberta's history. Because for several generations, Westerners have felt ignored and even exploited by Canada, and the sentiment building towards independence has been building over time as we experience these different exploitations. Now, when we look at the U.S. Declaration of Independence, it uses a phrase, a long train of abuses, to explain why the 13 colonies wanted to become independent from Britain. There have been a long train of abuses by the British government against the colonies, and Alberta has also experienced a long train of abuses over a long period of time from the Canadian government that justify why we become independent. Now, there's a sense in which Canadian Confederation has been unfair to the West right from the very beginning, as Todd mentioned. Like, this part of the world used to be called Rupert's Land. It was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, and Canada purchased Rupert's Land and annexed it to Canada without consulting the people that were here. There was already people here, especially in the Red River settlement. There was thousands of people. Some of them had a different idea of what their political future could be, but they weren't given a choice. They were just annexed to Canada without being consulted. Now, of course, afterwards, the prairies were settled by pioneers who would create farms, which was really good, but our farmers were forced to pay extra money for their farming equipment because there was a tariff to protect the manufacturers in Eastern Canada, so our farmers had to pay more. When we sold our grain, the farmers had to pay they had to sell their grain through middlemen, so they lost some money that way, and they also had to pay their transportation costs. So they didn't get as much money for their grain as they should have, so they were paying more for their equipment and getting less for their grain because of how Canada was set up. Now, this kind of a situation, led to many people being unhappy within Western Canada. These kinds of grievances kept many Westerners unhappy, but they were not angry enough to look towards independence. Instead of looking towards independence, they created reform political movements. Especially, they turned away from the mainstream political parties and they created alternative political parties. Among those were like the United Farmers of Alberta, which had a government here in the 1920s. And in the federal level, it was the Progressive Party of Canada in the 1920s was most popular in Alberta. But the biggest change of all, actually, came when we elected a social credit government in 1935. Now, electing a social credit government set Alberta apart from the rest of the world. It was worldwide news when Alberta elected that social credit government in 1935. And this is what Ted Byfield, the founder of Alberta Report, said about that election of 1935. While other provinces whined about the Depression, Alberta acted. We would not acquiesce in the misery we felt and saw around us. We would fight. We would rebel. If anything is characteristic of this province, it's that spirit of defiance. Push us far enough and we will strike back. That was our record and that is our reputation. So Albertans did fight back against Central Canada, but not to the point of looking towards independence. That all changed in 1968 when Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister. When Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister, a threshold was crossed, and for the first time, Westerners began to talk about independence seriously. Now, one of the things that Trudeau did that made Westerners unhappy was he brought in the Official Languages Act, which made French much more prominent in Western Canada, and a lot of people in the West felt we were having French thrust down our throats. But that was a relatively minor thing compared to what he would do afterwards. Now, so he became Prime Minister in 1968. He brought in the Official Languages Act. Some people started thinking about independence. The first book on Western independence was written in 1971. It was called The Unfinished Revolt, Some Views on Western Independence. It was a collection of essays edited by John Barr and Owen Anderson. And that's significant because John Barr was the executive assistant to Alberta's Minister of Education, and Owen Anderson was the executive assistant to Alberta's Premier, Harry Strom, our last social credit premier. So these were significant people with significant profiles. Now, the only essay that really dealt much with independence was John Barr's. His idea was this: first, we need to try to fix Canada, and if we can't fix Canada, then we need to be moving towards independence. And he wrote that in 1971, and it was an excellent idea in 1971. Let's try and fix Canada first. But that was more than 50 years ago. We've been trying for more than 50 years, and it's no longer a good idea because we've tried it and it hasn't worked. Anyway, the most significant thing that happened that caused people to think about Western independence, resulted from the energy crisis of 1973. There was a war in the Middle East in 1973, and oil prices skyrocketed. The oil prices went from about $3 a barrel to about $12 a barrel in just a few weeks. And so Alberta could finally cash in on our oil resources. Like, oil at $3 a barrel had been pretty good for Alberta for many years, but now we could really cash in. This was the only major resource that we had. And at that time, they thought we might only have 10 years or so of oil resources. They didn't have the technology we had at the time. So we really had to get our money's worth at that time so we could build for the future with a heritage fund, and then we'd have money for the future when the oil ran out. But Pierre Trudeau did a couple of things to make sure Alberta could not capitalize on the oil like we ought to. He brought in an export tax on oil, which meant when our oil was exported to the United States, the federal government would take a huge share of that revenue that should have gone to Alberta. And our Premier, Peter Lougheed, called that export tax on oil the biggest rip-off of any province that's ever occurred in Confederation's history. And at that point it was, in 1973. Now, the NEP would be worse, but at that point that was the worst thing. The other thing Trudeau did was he kept the price of oil within Canada low. So we didn't get a full world price when we sold our oil within Canada. So whether we exported it or sold it within Canada, we were not getting the money we should have for our oil. So throughout the 1970s, our Premier Peter Lougheed fought with Trudeau over these things, trying to get a fair deal for Alberta. There was a federal election in 1979 when Joe Clark's Progressive Conservatives were elected as a minority government. It was expected he'd do better for Alberta than Trudeau, and he would have, but his government fell after just a few short months, so it was a new federal election in 1980, and this 1980 federal election is very significant. During this campaign, the Trudeau Liberals made it very clear that they would favor the eastern provinces over the western provinces on energy issues in particular. And that was the time when Keith Davey, the Liberal activist, made that famous statement where he was describing this election, that their slogan was, "Screw the West, we'll take the rest." Now, the idea of running an election campaign by attacking one particular region was new and extremely divisive. Like, Canada's a large country with many regions. The regions have competing interests. So the purpose of the national government, or one of the purposes of the national government, is to try and accommodate various regions to create national unity. But here we had a federal political party, the Liberal Party of Canada under Pierre Trudeau, deliberately exploiting regional divisions for political benefit. And this is really significant and important to remember. Pierre Trudeau was telling Central Canadians that Alberta was the bad guy, and he would put Alberta in its place. So we have to keep in mind that a lot of the divisions we have in Canada trace back to Pierre Trudeau and the Liberal Party of Canada deliberately enhancing regional divisions for political benefit. So Westerners, of course, were angry when Pierre Trudeau was re-elected in 1980. He brought in the National Energy Program, as we heard about. The National Energy Program was an attempt by the federal government to take more control of Alberta's industry, oil industry, and to push Alberta down. And of course, the NEP devastated many Albertans. And I've had people come up to me at meetings and say, my dad lost his job at that time, or my parents lost their houses. There's people alive today, many, who were affected by that policy, by deliberate government policy to hurt Alberta. Like, it wasn't an accident. That's what they were trying to do. So Trudeau's anti-Alberta policies permanently changed Alberta's political culture. Before 1980, when surveys were done on independence in Alberta, support levels were in the single digits, like 4, 5, 6%, something like that. Since 1980, when they do surveys on Alberta independence, it's always in the double digits, like as low as 15 or 16% many years ago, but consistently 20% or more since then. That was a permanent change in Alberta's political culture that was a result of Pierre Trudeau and his policies, and that's why I say Pierre Trudeau is the father of the Alberta separatist movement. Anyway, as a result of the support for separatism at that time, there was a by-election in 1982, and Gordon Klessler of the Western Canada Concept Party was elected because there was so much support for independence. But even though many Albertans were looking to independence at that time, there were many others who were talking about that idea of let's try to reform Canada first, as John Barr had talked about. Now, among those people were Senator Ernest Manning, who had been Alberta's longest-serving premier. Him and a couple other prominent citizens wrote a book in 1981 called Regional Representation, the Canadian Partnership. Now, their idea was to reform national institutions so that Western voices could be heard within the national government. Their main proposal was for Senate reform. We could reform the Senate so that our voice as Albertans could be heard within the national government so that we wouldn't be ignored. So we could change national institutions that way. And they proposed this in 1981 because that's when the constitutional discussions were being taken. So they were the provinces and the federal government had the opportunity at that time to change our national institutions. Our voices could be heard, and then we wouldn't feel alienated. We wouldn't feel like we're being ignored out west. But of course, they were ignored. Now, Pierre Trudeau resigned in 1984. He was replaced by John Turner. There was a federal election. Brian Mulroney was elected, and people in Alberta felt relief because all of our MPs were progressive conservative. We saw Mulroney as the guy that was going to save us from what Pierre Trudeau was doing. So it was time to relax. Everything was good. But it turned out not to be so good because just like any other federal government, a progressive conservative federal government has to cater to central Canada if it wants to stay in power. That's the way the Canadian system works. And so an issue came up in 1986. Canada had recently bought the CF-18 fighter jets. Those CF-18 fighter jets had to be maintained. It was a very expensive government contract involving a lot of money. There was 2 cities in Canada with the facilities that could maintain those CF-18 jets, Winnipeg and Montreal. So the government held a competition to see which of those cities would be best at maintaining it. Winnipeg won the contract on the basis of the government criteria, so Mulroney awarded the contract to Montreal, obviously for political reasons. This is just because, like I mentioned, the Canadian political system is set up so that if you want to be in power, you want to remain in power, you have to cater to central Canada. Now, the result of that uproar from the CF-18 issue led to the creation of the Reform Party of Canada. Of course, the Reform Party's motto was, "The West wants in," and this reflects what Ernest Manning had been talking about. We need a political system that represents the West, gets our voice within the national government so they could hear us and not keep ignoring us. Now, this is a photocopy of a pamphlet I brought from 1987. It's from the Reform Association of Alberta. This is a proposal for the Reform Party of Canada in 1987. I just want to read you a couple of sentences from here to get an idea what they're talking about. Throughout our history, Ontario and Quebec have held the lion's share of political influence in Canada, and they continue to dominate the national scene at the expense of the West. Our political and economic development is being hamstrung by the vested interests of the Golden Triangle establishment of Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. The Western economy continues to languish, and Western influence in national economic and political decision-making is insufficient to bring about meaningful change. This is written 38 years ago, and the exact same words apply today. Nothing has changed in 38 years. Now, the following year, in 1988, there was a progressive conservative MP in Edmonton named David Kilgour, and he wrote a book called Uneasy Patriots, Western Canadians and Confederation. And he wanted to explain to people why Western Canadians feel upset within Canada. And he came to this, he explained why, and this is the conclusion he reached. The time has come to address a long-standing injustice and bring the West into equal partnership with all other regions of the country. So in 1988, he's saying the time has come to fix this inequality. Like, that's 37 years ago. And at that time, it did look like the time had come because the Reform Party was really getting going at that time, and Westerners were getting behind the Reform Party. It looked like things were going to change in our benefit. Because, yeah, like I said, with the Reform Party, it looked like the time had come. The Reform Party proposed a Triple E Senate. That'd be a Senate that was elected by the people, because, of course, we don't have elected senators. There'd be equal number of senators from each province, and they'd have effective power. So a Senate like that would have represented Western interests in the federal government. But the federal government is not interested in that. So the Reform Party won, 52 seats in the 1993 election. They won more seats the following election. But over time, the Reform Party turned away from its emphasis on Western issues and became more and more focused on achieving national government. They transformed themselves into the Canadian Alliance. Then the Canadian Alliance joined with the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada in 2003 to form the new Conservative Party of Canada under Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper became Prime Minister in 2006. As Todd mentioned, he was a good Prime Minister compared to others, and he was trusted by Westerners because he was one of the original reformers. He'd been a Reform Party MP. He was an MP from Calgary. So as long as Stephen Harper was in power, Westerners could trust him to do what's best for us. Anyway, though, as we know, Justin Trudeau was elected in 2015, and he brought in an anti-energy policy program. Todd mentioned some of these, the No More Pipelines Act, the Alberta tanker ban, and other policies that essentially were harming Alberta's oil industry. Like the Constitution guarantees provincial ownership and control of natural resources and oil development, but these policies by Trudeau essentially subverted the Constitution. They undermined the constitutional provision for the provinces to control those things, and they were putting federal government control over what we were doing. Now, so far I've just talked about the bad news and come to an end here, but as has been mentioned by Dr. Modry, there is a constitutional pathway for a province to become independent. In 1995, the federal government sent a reference case to the Supreme Court asking if Quebec could unilaterally secede from Canada, and the court said Quebec could not unilaterally secede from Canada. However, if Quebec held a referendum on independence with a clear question and a clear majority voted in favor of independence, then the federal government would have an obligation to negotiate Quebec's independence. So the point is, there's a peaceful, constitutional, and legal pathway for every province in Canada to pursue independence. And this is very different from many other countries because most other countries don't allow that kind of thing to take place. Okay, all of this leads to the conclusion that Alberta must become independent. Over the last several decades, there have been many proposals by serious people how to improve Alberta's situation within Canada. I've mentioned John Barr in 1971, Ernest Manning and his colleagues in 1981, David Kilgour in 1988. These were all significant citizens, but their proposals were ignored. Most significant of all was Preston Manning and the Reform Party. Alberta voted overwhelmingly for the Reform Party and sent mostly Reform Party MPs to Ottawa during the 1990s. They were good people and they tried to do their best for the West, but they found that the system could not be fixed. That is the message of the experience of the Reform Party. Canada's political system cannot be fixed in a way that is beneficial for Alberta. We can learn from history, and we must learn from history. If Preston Manning and the Reform Party could not get a Triple E Senate and otherwise reform Canada's political system, then it cannot be done. The West has tried to fix Canada. The West has tried to fix Canada, but Canada does not want to be fixed. Therefore, the only remaining alternative is to get out. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you. Well done.